all of the books, I have had a murderer. I know who the murderer is when I start out writing, but I also know that that might well change. And it has changed with all 4 thrillers.
Really? It's changed who the murderer
It's
is.
changed. And I think that's really exciting when you think, well, I thought it was this person, but actually, no, it's you. I hadn't realized. That makes so much more sense. Like everything sort of comes together and it's you for this reason. And that for me shows me that that's when the characters are starting to inform the plot. It's not like me trying to sort of superimpose, a kind of superstructure onto my characters. It's coming from them.
Hello, everyone. I'm Jeremy Siegel. I am a host and reporter here at GBH and a global transportation correspondent for the international news program, The World. And tonight I am thrilled to be hosting GBH's Beyond the Page with Lucy Foley. Lucy is the author of 6 novels, including The Paris Apartment, The Guest List, and most recently, The Midnight Feast. She studied literature at Durham University and University College London before working for several years as a fiction editor in the publishing industry. She now lives in London, and we are so excited to have her joining us this evening. So without further ado, please welcome to Beyond the Page, Lucy Foley. Hello, Lucy.
Hi, thanks so much for having me. Thanks to
Thank you so
GBH.
much for being here.
Thanks,
And
Jeremy.
for everybody who is watching and listening, Lucy is in London where it is much later than it is here on the East Coast. So we really appreciate you taking time during your late evening, early morning to do this. It's kind of perfect given that the title of your latest novel is The Midnight Feast because it's midnight now for you,
It's
right?
literally midnight. It is 4 minutes past midnight. It's quite exciting being up this late. It's very sort of quiet and calm, and the stars are out, and yeah, it feels a bit magical.
Well, let's get started with a bit of a midnight feast of our own. I want to ask about your latest work. It takes place at the opening weekend of The Manor, which is a luxury resort built in an ancient forest. Similarly to your other books, there's a big mystery at the center of it, but more so than your others, folklore and folk horror takes center stage in this. What made you interested in exploring folklore?
Really good question. I mean, I think it's always something that I've had sort of there somewhere to some degree in the thrillers. But yes, as you say, never so much as with this one. I think partly it was the setting. So I'm so inspired by setting in all the thrillers. Setting is like a character in the book for me, with all of them. And in this book, it is the West Country in the UK. It's the Dorset coast. It's this really beautiful part of the country. It's also a really ancient part of the country, as in the history there goes back, I mean, really to the time of King Arthur, the Arthurian legends, but even before that, you've got standing stones everywhere you look. You've got Glastonbury, you've got Stonehenge, you've got apparently underneath Glastonbury Tor, there's a secret portal to the underworld. But I mean, the land there is just so, you've got Neolithic burial mounds. The land there is so rich in ancient history, in folklore. And so I really wanted to come up with my own kind of myth or legend that sort of fit the area where I've set the book. But it was also, I think it was this idea of kind of who owns the land. Is it these newcomers, these blow-ins, these sort of wealthy people from the city coming to enjoy the countryside for a weekend? Or is it the local community who have kind of lived and farmed the land for generations? And it's the sort of, I guess, the tension between those two communities that's at the very heart of the book. And the folklore very much comes out of the local rural community. So
What
there you go.
interests you about that tension? Before we went live with this conversation, you were mentioning that you were watching The White Lotus earlier, which deals with some similar things. You know, it's sort of rich people coming into a place that people live in, and tension ensues. What made you particularly interested in exploring that relationship?
Gosh, great question. I mean, I think, I guess from the sort of golden age sort of murder mystery point of view, which really kind of inspires my books and sort of informs them, you've got that kind of that's the sort of modern formulation of that upstairs downstairs dynamic in some ways, or certainly I've got that in the world of this hotel. And you've got the kind of local community who are coming to work at the hotel. You've got Eddie as one of the main characters. He's sort of the lowest rung on the hierarchy in the hotel. He's the kind of hot washer in the kitchen, I guess, is what he sort of starts out as. But, you know, it's something I'm just more generally interested in. I live in the countryside. I grew up in the countryside. I moved to London. I've come back to the countryside. I've come back to about 25 minutes away from my parents where I grew up. And in some ways, I feel like I sort of awkwardly embody that tension. And funny enough, speaking of the White Lotus, I was reading an interview with Mike White recently, and he said that he's got a house, I think, in Hawaii. And he felt when he was writing the first season of The White Lotus that he sort of embodied that tension, and that if he's not kind of feeling implicated in some way by that tension and by that setup, then it doesn't kind of work for him. So I guess there's a little bit of that for me in writing this book. But then I've been the country dweller. I have also been the Eddie. I've worked in many sort of service jobs. I've worked as a waitress. I've worked behind bars. So it was also kind of bringing, I guess, some of that perspective into things as well. But I think specifically that sort of countryside city dweller thing, in some ways, this feels very much like a sort of, I hate to use the C word, the COVID word, but it feels like a kind of post-COVID book in the sense that, you know, we'd already seen this thing of sort of certainly in places like Cornwall and indeed in the West Country, sort of wealthy city dwellers buying second homes there, sort of taking over a little bit. But I think that just accelerated with COVID. You had people thinking, you know, oh gosh, actually the countryside's quite a nice place really, and there's a bit more space here, and there's a bit of kind of room to breathe. And I think that tension has only increased since sort of 2020. And I think we're seeing that kind of all over really. I think they've got the same issue in France, same in the US, I think. So yeah, this idea of sort of wealthy city dwellers moving to or visiting the countryside and sort of expecting a kind of quote unquote authentic experience, but really wanting, like, as I say in the book, very clean pigs and, you know, the special kind of designer wellies that they can put on to sort of trot along and collect some eggs, but not really wanting nature red in tooth and claw, not wanting the countryside with all its kind of authentic smells and unsightly, you know, rusting farm machinery. So it was kind of fun to really play on that.
You mentioned how important the setting is to you and how it's like a character, and setting's very important to your other works too. You know, the guest list on an island off the coast of Ireland, the Paris apartment in a Paris apartment. How do you choose the settings of your work, and is that usually where it begins for you?
I think it's definitely, I often feel like a book needs sort of three things for me to really ignite, and one of those tends to be the setting. So it's often kind of setting the germ of an idea for the sort of situation, whether it's a kind of wedding or it's the opening of this new hotel, and then normally at least one of the characters, you know, to come to me really clearly, and then the thing sort of really sparks to life. But yeah, I would say it really doesn't come to life until I know where it's going to be set. I mean, with the guest list, it was a funny one because actually I had the idea for the wedding. That was very clear. I thought it would be really fun to, an evil fun, to set a murder mystery at a wedding, because you can kind of use that sort of emotion, tensions running high, and also that kind of wonderful wedding structure that you have to sort of to kind of structure your murder mystery. But I didn't have the setting. And for ages, I thought I wanted to set it on a Greek island. And then I had this conversation with my editor and I was like, it's not working. It's not feeling kind of murdery enough. I can't quite work out why. And she was like, do you think it's feeling a little bit Mamma Mia with the wedding on the Greek island? I was like, oh yeah, it did remind me of something. And what's been wonderful actually really about all the settings is they've sort of come to me accidentally. So I my husband and I had happened to book a trip to the west coast of Ireland, where half my family are from. We got the boat out to one of the islands off Connemara, which is on the west coast there. Got the boat out to Inishbofin, and it was sort of standing there with like the wind blowing in from the Atlantic. It was like, this is the place to set that destination wedding, because it's really beautiful, but it could also be really cut off. You know, there are times where the sea's just too rough, the boats can't come, you might not be able to get back. It was that sense of sort of real isolation, and again, like nature red in tooth and claw. It was like, this is the spot, and from there the book just really came to life.
Your latest book, the Midnight Feast, has 3 different timelines, 4 different narrators, a huge web of mystery. There are several posts online breaking down the ending and how it all comes together, which I had to look at after I finished the book. But I was wondering, while reading it, like, how do you piece it together when you're writing? You mentioned figuring out the setting and having sort of one character driving things, but how do you put the pieces together? What's that process like? I kind of imagine a big whiteboard
Oh,
with strings and sticky notes spread out, but how
I
do you?
would love, I would love for it to be that organized. I think my husband would love for it to be that organized. He's a very sort of logical, he's got a very logical brain. And he has said to me several times, sort of quite hopefully, like, don't you think this time it would be great to have that whiteboard with the strings, you know, the sort of beautiful. And I can't really do it like that. I guess I've sort of got that whiteboard in my head. But really for me, it's like, yeah, it's like a gigantic mental jigsaw puzzle. And I'm moving things around all the time. But really for that first draft, I have to be able to move things. It all has to be kind of quite up in the air. And I have to be able to move things around will regularly. Um, because I don't plot desperately carefully. I have an idea where I'm starting out, an idea of where I'm ending up, possibly, and some sort of staging posts along the way, and some really exciting sort of set piece scenes that I can see really clearly. But for me, plot has to come from character for it to feel real, and I get to know my characters by writing them. I live with them for a little bit, but then I start writing, and that's when I really get to know them, because you sort of work stuff out on the page. I think you realize things don't work in the way you thought they did, and I have to leave room for things to change, or it's not exciting and it doesn't work. It feels dead. So that is the only way I can do that, and I think, gosh, I'm how many books in am I now? I wrote 3 historicals before the thrillers. So this is my 8th book. And I have finally made my peace with the fact that this is the way I do it. And it's the way that works for me. And I am a proper author. I've had such imposter syndrome about this. It's like, no, you should be doing it in this really organized way and sort of know exactly what anyone's doing at any given moment. And yeah, just doesn't work for me. So there you go.
I've read that you like to do first drafts by hand on paper. I mean, this is like an upwards of 300-page book. How do you do that?
I mean, I actually find it really freeing. I just have a lot of notebooks and I scribble in them. But what's so freeing about it is that it means that I can write absolutely anywhere. I can write on a beach, on my knee on a train, in a bar. I've written in all these places, in a pub, in a park, while I'm waiting to pick up my son from nursery, you know, all of these things. It just, I don't know, there's also something for me that's very kinetic about like the writing process, like actually writing something by hand, that doesn't feel as sort of intimidating as sort of looking at the screen and that kind of blinking cursor that can feel quite stark sometimes. So for me, it's just a way of like getting things flowing, and it's a great cure for writer's block. I think just the page and a pen, and yeah, maybe a nice coffee as well. But it also means that if I've got kind of everything written by hand, obviously I then have to type it up, which actually means that when I come to put it on the computer, I've essentially done like the first editing process, because I have to make kind of decisions even then about what's actually going to make it onto the Word document. So that's quite helpful, I think.
Is it fun for you writing? I think earlier you mentioned something like sort of a devilish pleasure with some of the things that happen with characters. Are you entertained while you're doing it? Like, is it
Oh
a
my goodness.
moment of fun?
Yes. Yes, it's so much fun. That first draft for me is the really fun bit. Like there are other bit, the editing process is so important. And as an ex-editor, I know that, I know that so well. But that is the bit where it really feels like work. There are fun bits, there are really satisfying bits, but the really like creative freeing bit is that first draft, from sort of start to finish. Obviously, there are moments where you think, I have no idea, especially if you don't plot everything out in advance. I have no idea where I'm going next with this, or actually I've written myself into a bit of a corner here. I need to write myself back out. But no, I love it. And there's really sort of spooky things that happen when you're writing where it does. I used to think it was so cheesy when writers said things like this before I became a writer myself, but where it feels like the characters are really taking over, when you're writing dialogue and they start saying things and you're not really conscious of having sort of put that in their head, if you know what I mean. That's where it feels like the magic starts happening. Or when you suddenly have an idea from what feels like totally left field, from some subconscious part of your brain of how to solve something, or for a really big twist. I had the idea for the sort of midpoint twist in the Paris apartment. Literally, when I was like getting onto a train, I was getting onto a Eurostar. Funny enough, maybe that was why I was on my way to Paris, getting onto the Eurostar, lifting my bags on, and it fell into my head. I was like, "That's the twist," and I wasn't consciously thinking about it. So though I live for those moments as a writer.
Do you always try to like have the ending in mind while you're writing? We have a number of pre-submitted audience questions from folks who wrote to us before the event began. And one of them, I'm trying to see who this was who wrote in with it earlier. Amy asks if you know the ending when you begin. I think you mentioned a little bit earlier that you have a general sense of it, but a lot of the time, I mean, it is so complex where things end up in your book. It's hard to imagine not knowing that. How much do you know?
So I think for my own peace of mind, I have to know what the ending could be. So I have an ending. So I often so with all of the books, I have had a murderer. I know who the murderer is when I start out writing, but I also know that might well change, and it has changed with all four thrillers.
Really, it's changed who the murderer
It's
is.
changed. And I think that's really exciting when you think, well, I thought it was this person, but actually, no, it's you. I hadn't realized. That makes so much more sense. Like everything sort of comes together and it's you for this reason. And that for me shows me that that's when the characters are starting to inform the plot. It's not like me trying to sort of superimpose, a kind of superstructure onto my characters. It's coming from them. If that makes sense. It's sort of a very weird writerly thing to say, but I also think, if I'm surprised, then hopefully the reader will be too.
Did want to ask Lucy, you mentioned convincing yourself or becoming aware that you are indeed a professional writer. You worked in publishing for many years before becoming a published novelist yourself. You mentioned other jobs that you've worked. Did you always know that you wanted to write books?
Oh my goodness. I mean, no, I knew that I wanted to work with books in some capacity. I've always been a huge reader, huge book lover. That's why I studied English lit at uni, as a master's. I was desperate to get into publishing because I was like, that way I can just work with books all day long. And it was like a dream come true. I actually worked in like, I realized recently, in all aspects of the publishing industry, pretty much, because I worked in a bookshop, first of all, as a bookseller. Then I worked as a receptionist in a literary agent. Then I got into the kind of editorial side of things, eventually became a fiction editor. But also, when I was writing my first book, I worked for a literary scout, which was really interesting because they're kind of like spies in the industry. They have this really interesting job. So I always knew I wanted to work with books, and I'd always loved any kind of creative writing at school, anything like that. I used to tell my brother and sister stories when we were little. I'd pretend to be, this really ages me, but I'd pretend to be a tape machine, and they had to put tapes in the tape machine. And then every so often the tape would scramble or more. And anyway, yes. So I love that, but funny enough, I'd sort of stopped writing or storytelling for pleasure. Definitely by my 20s, I never really kept a diary. So I wasn't really doing that much writing. I think it was working in the publishing industry, sort of talking about stories every day, living in that world. It made it feel quite accessible, but it also made it feel like, oh, this is something I really want to try. I really love telling stories. I want to try and tell my own. And so the rest is history.
Did it make it easier to write yourself? I mean, you so often hear about the struggle of writing books, especially when authors talk about sometimes their second book, after the first, that the first was the one you always knew you wanted to write, and then having the writer's block of the second. Being inside the industry, does it in a way make it easier to treat it as a job? I mean, you've been incredibly productive, 8 books in less than a decade. Did that help?
I think absolutely. I think what really helped kind of take some of the sort of intimidation factor out of it was sort of seeing books at every stage of the process. So you knew that when they first came in, like these were brilliant authors that we were working with, but those books needed a lot of work. Like sometimes the kind of final published hardback bore very little resemblance to that first draft. So I think that showed me, obviously, funny enough, when you do submit your first book, it has to be super polished because you want kind of people to take notice of it. But it also showed me that, it didn't have to be absolutely perfect straight off the bat, that there would be a process. And I think it also, working with great authors, it sort of showed me their work ethic. We had authors that delivered much more regularly than I did. There's one author who I know now as a kind of friend, but she delivered 25 years, a book a year every year. And I
Wow.
think for a couple of years where she delivered like more than a book a year. So, that is real dedication.
We have a bunch of really great questions that have come in. One asks, the guest list was so wonderfully creepy. Have you been to an unusual wedding that inspired this book?
Oh my goodness, I think I probably have to say no, so no one sues me or no. I've oh my goodness. I felt like I'm sort of protesting too much. No, I've been to some wonderful weddings. Funny enough, when I wrote the book, it was a time where we were kind of late 20s, early 30s. We were going to a lot of weddings. So there was sort of, in a way, a lot of inspiration there. Not that I drew from anyone's wedding in particular, but it was just that thing of realizing that you've got all these really interesting groups of people at a wedding that in an evil way, in a murder mystery, you can kind of play with. You've got the old friends, you've got the new friends, you've got the colleagues, you've got the sort of guests that no one really knows why they're there. The people like Hannah very much feels she's the plus one. She very much feels like a sort of an add-on, like she's not really part of this world. And I've been that sort of plus one at a wedding, right? You don't know anyone, and it's going to be like actually hard work because everyone's sort of, like the ushers do, kind of falling back into their kind of old friendship dynamic, and you're just sort of there on the outside looking in. So all of that, going to a lot of weddings is really helpful, but I didn't go to any particularly creepy weddings, or definitely no weddings where anyone got murdered. But funny enough, I did actually, one of my Irish family reminded me that I did go to a big Irish wedding in Connemara, not on an
Really?
island, but
Yeah.
probably the first wedding I ever went to. I think I was about 2 at the time. So maybe that went into my subconscious somehow.
Another similar question from Tanya, who says, similar to the question about unusual weddings, I recently finished the Paris apartment and wondered where the inspiration for the house's residents and their mysterious relationships came from.
Really good question. I don't want to give any spoilers away here, so I'm going to be really careful in how I answer this. But the sort of first idea for the apartment building, for the kind of neighbors sort of looking at one another, a sort of voyeuristic thing, actually came from, so I rented for a couple of weeks an apartment in Paris, not actually nearly as glamorous as the apartment building in the book, but I'd rented this apartment to finish a draft of the guest list, because I love doing that. I love taking myself on a kind of little writing retreat. And it was sitting there, and I was kind of looking out the window. I'd watch my sort of temporary neighbors coming and going. I'd hear them moving around. It sounds really creepy of me, like I'm sort of spying on them, but I'd hear them moving around in their apartments. I'd sort of meet them passing on the stairs. And because I'm a storyteller and that's what I do, I started to kind of invent little sort of stories about them. And then I was like, this could be a book. So yeah, that the sort of rest is history. That was the first spark for that.
Kathy wrote to us asking, how did you move from historical fiction to thrillers?
Well, funny enough, it wasn't a conscious choice. It was again a setting that sort of inspired that. So I was actually meant to be writing a fourth historical book at the time, which never got written. Well, about half of it got written. And we were traveling up to again just for a little holiday. My poor husband, I sort of turned these holidays into like book plotting exercises, but we were driving up to this remote spot in the Scottish Highlands. We were renting a cottage on this estate. And as we were driving up, I was reading the instructions, the kind of email that they'd sent, and they said, in the event of very heavy snowfall, you may find that you are unable to leave the estate. And I looked up, and as I did, the first flakes of snow started to fall. And I got kind of full body chills. It was like, that sort of being stuck on this estate in the snow, that's this sort of, for me, it felt like the perfect setup for this sort of classic golden age murder mystery, which I've always loved. You know, I read my first Agatha Christie's, I think, when I was 12, way too young. And so that sort of started to tick away. And then when we got there, the setting was just so perfect. You know, it's the most remote train station in the British Isles. It's just this tiny little like one platform, and the train sort of chugs along, and it's beautiful, but it's really isolated. The snow fell. We had this really beautiful thick snowfall. And yeah, I basically spent the next week like tramping around, working out. Sounds really grim, but like, that's where they could find the body, you know, and that's where this could happen. And I could incorporate this beautiful sort of lodge structure, and I could have them go on a hunting trip, all of that. And really, this has never happened to me before, but by the end of the week, having said I don't really plot, I had most of the plot sort of sketched out in my head, and then it was sort of coming up with those characters and really fleshing it out. And then, of course, everything started changing, but it was so exciting to have so much of the book come to me so clearly, so quickly. And sort of, again, the rest is history. It was, you know, I as a reader never sort of thought too much in terms of genre. You know, I read everything, and I still read everything. I think it was going into publishing, I realized, you know, there were sort of strict sort of demarcations, like crime and thriller, historicals, you know, women's fiction, which is like a horrible term, you know, all of that. And what I've always loved as a reader, and what I've always just tried to write, is a really good story, often with a mystery at its heart. So the historicals had that too. You know, hopefully great characterization. Yeah. And that's sort of what I hopefully tried to bring across from the historicals to the thrillers.
You mentioned reading Agatha Christie when you were too young, and we have a few questions about inspiration and things you've read. Paige asked if Agatha Christie is a big inspiration, and Denise also asked, have any classic mystery writers inspired you?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I kind of always go back to my like unholy trinity of female kind of classic crime writers. I would say I've got Agatha Christie for plot, Daphne du Maurier for atmosphere, Patricia Highsmith for character. And if I'm ever stuck, I think, what would they do? So those are the kind of biggies in terms of the kind of classical authors that inspire me. But then there are so many kind of modern authors that inspire me, from like the Gillian Flynns, Lisa Jewell, I think is brilliant. I just read her new book that's coming out in the summer. people like Ellie Griffiths. I don't know if people have read her books over there, but I think she's wonderful. She's got a brilliant series. So I'm, yeah, really inspired by sort of contemporaries as well.
How much are you able to read while you're writing? Do you purely focus on your own work, or do you still read while you're working on a project?
I read all the time, absolutely loads. I'm that person that, like, even if I'm in the shower, I have to be reading the label on like the shampoo bottle. I I always need to be like, so when I mean, it makes me sound a bit weird, but I quite frequently, like, if I'm not, if I'm cooking or if I'm in the car, I'll be listening to an audiobook. If I go for a run, I'm often listening to an audiobook. Brushing my teeth. Yeah. And the rest of the time, I'm pretty much reading or writing. So there you go. I'm a proper book geek. But yeah, just story all the time.
There's also TV on top of that, and
I was
Betsy.
gonna say, I'm also, what I had forgotten there is well, obviously hugely inspired by traveling and all of that, but hugely inspired by film and TV, but really by film. And in this book, The Midnight Feast, there's so much there. But off the top of my head, there's Hitchcock, particularly The Birds. There are all these kind of folk horror films, like Midsummer would be a more modern one, but Wicker Man would be an older one.
I was thinking about that while I read, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh gosh, there are loads more there, but now off the top of my head, I can't think of them. But there are sort of little Easter eggs for the film lovers throughout the book. So if you can spot them, you sort of know.
Betsy asked, how do you feel about The Hunting Party being made into a TV series? Says, I'm watching it and it's very good.
Oh, that confusingly is not actually my book. That is another TV series, very sadly, called The Hunting Party, which sounds brilliant, and I want to watch it. My book is actually being made into a TV series. Actually,
Oh,
no, The Hunting Party is currently being made into a film,
hmm.
confusingly. So yes, just to clear that one up.
How has that process been?
Credit. I'm glad you're enjoying it. Thank you. Great title.
How is the process of film adaptation for The Hunting Party been?
Really exciting. I know I can't, I'm so indiscreet. I really want to share, but I know we've got an actress that's really interested in playing the lead role. So that's all quite exciting. Actually, all four of the thrillers are currently in production, in some capacity. So, yeah, just had some really exciting news about the Midnight Feast actually on that score. So, yeah, it's sort of like which one's going to happen first. So that's quite exciting.
There's always been a fascination with thrillers and with mysteries. It goes back really far, but right now it does sort of feel like we're in a moment, both with novels and with television, TV, also podcasts. What do you think is behind this moment?
Oh my goodness. I mean, great question. I think for me, my interest, I'm not actually, funny enough, I'm not a massive true crime fan because I'm actually, weirdly, considering I write these dark books, I'm actually quite squeamish. But I say that, but there are a couple of true crime series that I've listened to and I've loved. And I think just in general, with kind of mysteries, with the sort of fascination with that, it's the puzzle. That's what it is for me. It's kind of, why is that person acting in that way? What secret is that person keeping? Like, what is the weird look that's passing between these two people? Why is that thing important? What is that thing in the past that no one will talk about? That's what really kind of excites my brain. It excites my brain as a writer when I'm writing these books, and it definitely excites my brain as a reader when I'm reading them. And I think what I love about the murder mystery format is you have got this sort of, it's like a contract between the writer and the reader. You've got this sort of, I'm going to present you with a puzzle, but I'm going to play fair. The clues are going to be there. There'll be a few red herrings, yes, but if you're paying attention, the clues are there. I'm not going to sort of pull any rabbits out of hats. You've got the tools to solve it if you spot everything. And then there is going to be this hopefully wonderful reveal at the end where you're like, oh, but of course, or oh, that surprised me, but actually now I can see it. I love that moment as a reader, and that's what I really want to give people as a writer.
Well, we're continuing to talk about sort of other media and thrillers. Nikki wrote saying, "How did you feel when the scene in Moonflower Murders, which, if folks aren't familiar, it's a television series that you can watch on PBS, but the scene in Moonflower Murders used an entire bookshelf of just your thrillers. They said, 'I cheered for you.' Have you seen that? Have you noticed it or heard about it?"
I am grateful to Anthony Horowitz, who is the writer of Moonflower Murders
Mhm.
and also screenwriter. I am grateful to him forever. He's just like the kindest man, like the most generous author. I've only actually met him once. We did an event together once, and he was always really, really nice about the books. He was like, "I love what you do with the kind of multi POV thing, and all of that." He's been really lovely, and I've always really admired his books. I think they're so clever. The you've got like the mystery within the mystery, and there's always something slightly, I don't know, kind of playful about them. And then I suddenly got this thing, this kind of request for, could Anthony feature your books in the new series? And I had to approve the screenplay and things, but I thought, this is too good to be true, this is never going to happen. And then it actually happened, and it's just mad. I've had people being like, did your publishers pay for this? Like, is this a plug for the books? I'm like, no, it's just this lovely organic thing that's happened, this lovely tribute. So yeah, I was absolutely thrilled.
Is there ever a concern while you're writing? You've talked a little bit about the personal inspiration that's gone behind things, be it setting or places you've been. Do you ever feel a concern that someone might come to you and say, "Hey, I feel like you took this part of me and made it into a character"? Do you draw inspiration from people you know, and is there ever a worry that you are writing
Oh
about
my
stuff you
goodness.
know?
I mean, great question. Apparently, no one ever recognizes an unflattering portrait of themselves in fiction. So maybe I'm like protected by that, first of all. But no, I mean, I really try not to. I think to myself, oh gosh, all of this has just come from my imagination. Where has it come from? So it's quite useful having my husband actually as my first reader, because he's great at spotting. He's like, from this conversation, like not bad things, but he'll often be like, that came from this, or do you
Hmm.
remember, does that come from this? And I'm like, oh, actually, maybe it does. But no, I mean, very much, hopefully, mainly products of my imagination. Obviously, there are things that I've drawn from life, like in the hunting party, that kind of dynamic of the group of old friends. My old friends are nothing like the old friends in the book. They're lovely people, but it was that idea of the way we kind of fall back into our kind of old roles, like when we're with people that we were at college with, you might kind of almost regress to an earlier version of yourself. Or it's the same thing that happens like when you're with your siblings. If you've got siblings in your family, like I go back to like 15-year-old me. It's really weird. So it's sort of taking things like that then hopefully will kind of resonate with other people who are reading the book. And likewise with the weddings, sort of the general idea of the wedding and the emotions and like the different people you might have there, but I think mainly from imagination.
Hmm.
I do hear the odd like snippet of conversation in a cafe, and I think that is too good that is too good not to like write down in my little notebook and use somewhere, or like, you know, transmute in some way into something else. But yeah.
What about the focus in the Midnight Feast on there's also sort of the wellness industry element to your writing. Did choosing to tackle that come from any personal experience?
Big fan of anything that makes you feel better. I think, I've tried all sorts of things. I tried like Reiki, I can never pronounce it properly, Reiki, mindfulness, big fan of sort of mindfulness. I've got any spa treatment, I am there. Yes, please. But I think it was sort of thinking about, I think it was particularly through the prism of Francesca, this character who sort of rebranded herself as this sort of wellness goddess, and thinking about the fact that it's a pretty unregulated space and there are people making some fairly bold claims and making quite a lot of money off this
Mhm.
industry. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry now. Um, and the sort of snake oil element of that, I was kind of fascinated by, but also this idea of someone kind of trying to whitewash their past and sort of using wellness for evil in a way. So saying, well, I'm living in the moment, which is a great thing. And, I'm not dwelling on the past. But what if you're not dwelling on the past because you did some pretty awful things in the past that you've never atoned for? It's sort of in an evil way, kind of flipping on its head.
Mm. Shannon is curious about what's next for you. Says, I've read all of your books and I want to know what topic is next.
Very good question. I'm having a lot of fun writing it. It's actually a bit of a secret project, but it's not a secret project for very much longer. I think I'm able to talk about it, I think next month. So watch this space. It's something a bit different, but I'm excited.
Sidra asks about audiobooks, which it's fascinating to hear how much you listen to audiobooks. Sidra said, I love the audiobook version of your books. Do you have any involvement in selecting the narrators for your audiobooks?
Yes, I absolutely do. The audiobook editor is amazing. She's like so talented and she's just really good at finding those actors. I love the fact, as a kind of real audiobook fan, I love the fact that I get a cast of characters to voice the different to voice the different points of view. And so what she does is she will find like three actors for each role, and they do a kind of like a mini audition, and then I will listen to them read that little part, the same part of the book, in that role, and it's amazing. Straight away, it's like that is Eddie, or that is Miranda, or that is Francesca, or that you just as the author, you just it's amazing to hear these characters brought to life, and so I've never had a kind of, oh, is it this reader or that reader, trying to choose between them. So it's really fun to be part of the process because I feel like, yeah, I can bring a little bit of myself and the process of writing the book into it, and that kind of deep knowledge, hopefully, of those characters.
Jordan asks, who is your favorite or least favorite character you've written?
I probably the same character to to answer for both. Francesca, she's awful. She's absolutely awful, and I kind of hate her. But I absolutely loved writing her. Like, she was such a gift as an author. There are characters that you kind of mull over and you think, and they take a long time to come to you, and you have this sort of process of almost like, again, a really cheesy author thing to say, but like talking to them in your head, and you're not quite sure who they are, and you're sort of drawing them out. Francesca just like, she walked in the door and she was just there. She was absolutely there herself straight away. Her voice felt really clear to me. I knew exactly how she'd respond in any given situation. So, and she was just so much fun to write because she's just so outrageous, really. And it was a chance for me to sort of, I love kind of pushing the comedy a little bit. It sounds like a weird thing to say in a dark book, but she was a chance for me to kind of push the comedy, push the satire a little bit, even as she's this awful person that's done awful things. It was fun to kind of play with that tension with her.
We have a number of questions that are sort of about process and advice, and I want to get to those. But that made me think, like, does having a character of that nature who you find fascinating but also kind of repulsive, does it help with writing because you're kind of excited to hear what you do
Totally.
next?
Totally, absolutely. So I really looked forward to, because obviously I, write from multiple points of view. So I really looked forward to my like Francesca days when I was writing from Francesca's point of view. I often kind of counterbalanced her with Eddie because I also loved writing Eddie, who's this 19-year-old kind of like dishwasher, basically, like local farm boy. He's just kind of really pure. He's this sort of innocent, really, this lovely character. Well, I thought lovely character. And so I'd often sort of have to like, yeah, just like cleanse things with writing a bit of Eddie and then go back to so that was quite a nice contrast to have in this book.
One person watching said, as a writer, what advice do you have to create effective conflict and tension?
Oh, great question. I mean, first of all, it helps having a really outrageous character like Francesca. But I think the more you work on your characters and the more you sort of give them like spiky characteristics and strong opinions or strong elements of their personality that will then kind of grate against other characters' personalities. I think that that's going to do so much of the work for you. So if you know how they would react in any given sort of conversation, that they might be sort of, I don't know, really kind of needling or pushing I think that will in itself, like once you start writing dialogue, you'll immediately have this sort of wonderful tension there to work with. And then I would say just write loads of dialogue, even if it's not all going to make it into the book. Just kind of get to know them through that, because that for me, dialogue, to be honest, when I first started writing, it was the thing I dreaded doing because I found it hard, because I felt like I had to control everything at the beginning, and I had to have this real sort of authorial control. And actually, what I've realized now is dialogue's the bit where I can almost sit back a little bit as the writer and just sort of let things flow and see what happens and kind of muck in. And I think doing that, you get to know your characters really well. You can use some of that in the book, but you can also just use some of it to sort of inform your deeper understanding of character. I think I've said the same thing multiple times there, but yeah, dialogue.
When you're writing dialogue, do you think of it in terms of real conversation? Like, do you think, oh, what would these people say in this actual, what would it sound like hearing a conversation? Or do you think of it more in terms of, I need this person to say this, I need to convey these things? Like, is there a difference between the way dialogue appears in literature and real life?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there's always that thing of like, how do I make this sound as much like real conversation as possible without having all the ums and ahs and the weird, cul-de-sacs that people talk themselves into? But I also think there is a difference between the dialogue that you're writing as a writer, where it's like this slightly weird thing happens where you almost kind of sublimate yourself and you're not really aware that it's happening. Like it's this, again, cheesy writer thing to say, but it's like the characters take over and they're just talking. And then of course there are the slightly more awkward moments where you need to get something into a conversation, you need to get some information or some exposition in there, and that's always going to feel more synthetic. And then your job is to kind of make it feel as natural as possible, and sort of surround it with some lovely kind of more natural feeling dialogue, if that makes sense. You sort of have to bury it a bit better, because otherwise it will just feel like this character giving information to this other character, or this character being mysterious for some reason. So yeah, that's where it can feel a little bit more like work.
We have another question from Lorraine, who says, by working in the publishing industry, did it make it easier to have your book published without an agent working on your behalf?
No, I did get an agent. I think it gave me, to be honest, an understanding of the importance of getting a really good agent. And the kind of process for submitting to agents. But one thing I was really keen not to do, because I was still pretty junior in the industry, and it's a small industry, and I didn't know whether I'd written a good book or not. So I didn't want to embarrass myself. So I only sent out to agents that I had never worked with, that I'd sort of admired from afar. And I kind of went through the proper process. I kind of sent my 3 chapters in, I sent my covering email. But I think it really helped with understanding, well, first of all, how polished those 3 chapters that you send in have to be. Understanding, as I say, the importance of a good agent, someone that would really sort of advocate for you. Yeah, and just taking some of the mystique out of the whole process. That really helped.
We have talked a lot about process, but David wrote in asking if you could describe it a little bit more. And I'm curious, thinking about this, how much you map out the process of your writing. Do you set aside, I'm going to spend X number of months writing this, and then X number of weeks editing this, and then sharing it with other people? How much do you work out in advance, and what's that process like?
So my kind of preparatory work, I would say, is less plotting and more research in terms of the setting, the specifics of anything I need to do. I don't have a lot of kind of forensic stuff in my books. I mean, there's very little there. But in the Midnight Feast, for example, I knew that I wanted this sort of police strand. So I had to I talked to kind of a chief of police on the South Coast. He was super helpful in telling me what I was like, this is what I want to do. Can I do it? And he was like, well, actually, you can't do this and you can't do that, but you could do this. That was super helpful. So kind of doing all that preparatory work, sort of, yeah, plotting loosely in my head. But as I say, the plotting really starts once I start writing. I kind of plot when I go along. So that's my main preparatory work. Then in terms of how long I have to write, it's often up until my deadline. So that helps, having a deadline. And I'm very much motivated by a deadline. So it does feel like, if you gave me a deadline in 10 years' time, I'd probably spend 9 years doing like nice preparatory work, sort of floating around. I should probably do like 9 years and 6 months, like floating around, thinking about the book, and then 6 months of like all the work while crying. But that, in a way, that like pressure is where the book is really forged for me. That sort of working intensely on it. There's always what I would call like the essay crisis at the end, where I'm working on it, like I'm pulling all-nighters, I'm like kind of a bit feverish, I'm sort of having a little cry every so often, but that sort of has to happen for me, because that's also where I feel like, in a way, I feel like I have some of my best ideas or my most exciting ideas, or I solve things that I didn't think could be solved. Yeah, that sounds sort of painful, but that's how it works.
How do you get over the intimidation of tackling subjects that you might not have expertise on? Like you talked about law enforcement, or in the latest one, it being a retreat, or, like hotel management and wellness. How do you do that? I imagine it must be intimidating to think, I haven't run a wellness center or anything like this. How do you move forward with that?
Well, that was fun because I had to visit, lots of hotels and have lots of massages. No, I mean, I wish. I've got 2 small kids. It was really nice. I mean, I did visit a few hotels. It was also really nice imagining myself in a hotel room on my own, or like because I really wanted to be somewhere that, as the reader, you want to travel to, and you want to spend time there and exist in this very like luxurious world until suddenly you really don't. No, I mean, for me, that is really part of the fun of the writing, like that research element, like learning about how the police really work, or like kind of lifting the lid on this new world. Learning about like hotel management, all of that. In the same way that I think the reason I was first attracted to writing historical fiction was because I'm a massive history geek, and I wanted to kind of delve deeper into different periods in history. The very first book I wrote, the book of Lost and Found, revolves, it's kind of got an art mystery at its center. So it was like learning more about art and a kind of provenance of paintings. Also learning more about sort of pockets of history in the 20th century. Yeah, that's all part of the fun for me, that kind of geekery.
I have one last audience question that I think I can get to. David asked about advice you have for young authors, first-time authors. And I'd love to broaden that just a little bit also to anybody who's pursuing something creative like writing or something else. It's a very personal project. What's your advice?
Well, I would say if it's a novel you're writing, it's going to be a long old slog. 80,000, 100,000 words. It's a lot of words, but it's also very doable. If you can write 1,000 words a day, or even 500 words a day, it doesn't take that long until you've got to that word count. Sounds weird, but it's true. Math isn't my strong point, but it's true. But what I would say about that is you need to be really excited by that idea at the outset. There will be times where you lose faith in it. That happens to me writing every single book. There'll be times where you think, am I going to go the whole distance? But you need to have that real like, yes, I think I could sit with this idea for sort of 80,000 words. I want to know, I want to know this story. I want to kind of go there, because that's sort of the test I give myself as a kind of ex-editor, is like, would I want this book to land on my desk? You know, and how is it kind of doing something new that I haven't read before, something new and exciting. So even though, yes, you know, The Hunting Party was very much inspired by kind of golden age murder mysteries, it was like, but what if it's a kind of 21st century thing and I got this group of old friends? I don't feel like I've quite seen that. You know, that feels kind of fresh to me. So yeah, what's fresh about it? What excites you? If it excites you, it's going to excite a reader. If you want to go there, someone else is going to, if that makes sense. And then I would say that, yeah, it's just about forming the habit of writing, because that's the bit that's sort of fairly unsexy, is just sitting down and committing to getting words down on the page pretty much every day, every other day if you can. Because you want to be doing it regularly, because I find even over the weekend, I've sort of lost my connection to the book a little bit. So now I even try to write a little bit at the weekend, even around small kids and things, just to sort of keep that connection to the material. Having said that, sometimes it's really important to just go for a walk, do something else, go watch a really good film. If you've got to a point where you're stuck, do absolutely anything else other than sitting in front of your computer screen or at your notebook, just like trying to think, because there's something about going and doing something else, especially if it's something kind of kinetic like walking or having a shower or baking. It looses something in your subconscious. It unlocks something often, I find.
Well, Lucy Foley, it has been an absolute pleasure talking with you tonight. Thank you so much for the great conversation.
You too. Thank you so much for having me, and thanks to everyone for joining us.